Welcome back to Subversive Preacher for the 25th Sunday after Pentecost. The gospel for today is Matthew 25:14 through 30, which is kind of a long, arduous story you probably will recognize. But underneath it all, this problematic story from Matthew, it is about our default settings. Think computers here. The default setting, of course, is what will be used automatically next time. So if we want whatever action we are taking with our computer or our smartphone to be remembered and become the standard for how that action is to be done, then we need to set it as the default. Now, that's a metaphor that has all kinds of uses with this story, and many others for that matter. For example, we need a wide-angled lens for viewing this story from Matthew when our default setting in reading the Gospels and much of the Bible is to focus up close. But rather than pay a lot of attention to the specifics of Matthew's story, we need to actually see it through the filter of a wider perspective of what is around the story. Now, that idea, I'm not clever enough to know that on my own. I used Walter Brueggemann's text for preaching in this week. So if we look at just the story, all kinds of problems pop up. For example, nowhere in the story, nor in the Bible itself, is the institution of slavery questioned. Slavery in the Roman Empire and before it was not racial in nature. Slaves were the spoils of war and of economic misery. If you were poor enough, you sold your kids, you sold your wife, you even sold yourself into slavery. But it bothers me, and maybe you felt this way too when you read it, that Jesus just assumes slavery instead of objecting to it. But also problematic is that the master of the house, the guy who owns the slaves in this story, is supposed to be God. And what we may have noticed in the story is that the master gives his slaves an unimaginable burden, because these talents, or silver or gold coins as it says in other translations, represent a vast, vast sum. What the master gives the slaves to invest amounts to more money than even probably the richest person listening to this video can even imagine. It equates to billions, simply billions of dollars in our day. A slave would no more know what to do with billions of dollars than a baby knows what to do with a $100 bill. It would have terrified all three of them. Terror, just absolute terror. But even more disconcerting is that in the end, the story seems to be about reward and punishment. And hopefully, I hope, that creates some theological dissonance with our default settings. If we take Matthew literally, then God has an abusive parenting style. We can gather from the story that the third slave had a default setting that moved him toward prudence and caution to give them a positive value, or fear and mistrust as the master judged them. The master does not seek to understand or empathize in any way with the slave, even though it's clear that for reasons of psychology, family culture, personal circumstance, or all three, the third slave was limited by fear of failure, fear of danger, fear of judgment, fear of public humiliation, fear of punishment, fear of disapproval, or all of them. But now, in spite of having to live within such a dark silo of fear, this third slave has been condemned to also live now in total isolation. Where is the fairness? Where is the mercy? Where is the love? My theological default setting is of a God who is more generous, more gracious, a God who loves mercy more than justice. And so this story kicks up a default error code for me. This is when we need to zoom out and filter the particulars of the story through a much wider lens. Before Matthew sets Jesus up to tell this story about the master and the slaves, Jesus has just had a big argument with the religious authorities, whom we are told were not people of goodwill. Now that should sting a little for people like me. It turns out that those religious authorities were feeling threatened by Jesus and the reform movement that he was instigating. At the end of the argument, Jesus can be heard walking away, muttering to himself, grumpy and agitated. Jesus laments their rejection of his wisdom, and he mumbles a dark, oblique prediction about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple itself. Yeah, we'll see who has the last words here, he seems to be saying. In this bigger story, just before the master-slave parable gets told, Jesus and his pals leave the city, climb up the hill, the Mount of Olives, where they sit down on a spot that overlooks Jerusalem and the temple. Jesus' friends point to the temple below and ooh and ah about how just beautiful it looks, how amazing it is. Jesus says, yeah, you see that temple there? I'll tell you, there's going to come a time when there's not one stone piled on another stone. It'll all be rubble. Shocked at the thought, as we would be here in Geneva to contemplate the demolition of 520 South Main Street or the Washington National Cathedral or something that historic and large, the disciples asked, well, when is this going to happen? But instead of a direct answer, Jesus launches into a very long speech. Like Moses at the edge of the promised land, or like Martin Luther King Jr. on the eve of his death, Jesus gives a speech intended to prepare his disciples for what was to come. At the end of that speech, he tells them 4 parables. Each parable directs them away from the question about when will the end happen, and instead Jesus focuses them on what to practice between now and then. So this story about the 3 slaves is one of 4 stories told. And as such, it is about what to do in the meantime, what to do between now and when the crisis comes. Jesus is preparing them for how to manage the time between now and when the crisis comes. Of that time, no one knows, not even Jesus, he says. But between now and then, here are some things we need to do. What do we need to do in the meantime? In such times, for many of us in our institutions, our default settings are for preservation. How can we preserve the principle or corpus of the treasures we have? We have an instinct and maybe even an ingrained training to preserve the principle. Preserving the principle and not risking failure in a normal is our normal response. It is our default setting, particularly in times such as these. Preserving the principle is what we are taught to do so that in times of crisis we have something to lean on. Preservation is our default mode, and yet the slave that played it safe is angrily condemned. In bearing that which was given to him to be the steward of, it actually lost value, presumably because of inflation. Stuffing the mattress with cash actually causes it to lose value. Only with risk of investment does the treasure's potential grow. Jesus did not know anything about computers, nor did he know anything about Wall Street, but all the elements of greed, risk, and crisis existed in his day. Jesus charged his friends with taking risks and with launching out at the very moment everyone else around them was cringing in fear. Preserving the principle may be what an endowment is supposed to do, but it's not the mark of fidelity for a community of faith that says it's an agent of God's love. In the time between now and crisis, spiritual wellness is discovered and displayed by taking risks to love more boldly and to act more vigorously and to grow a heart a bigger size. Preservation doesn't grow anything. Only loving and loving more can grow the heart a bigger size. We are not, as spiritual communities, in the preservation business. We are not the custodians of historic buildings. We're not the archivists of a particular body of ritual and worship, language and music. But we are the stewards of the gospel, and we are agents of God's love made known through community. Whether as individuals trying to figure out how to move through our current political, economic, and environmental challenges, or as a community of faith, located here anyway in Trinity Place, located wherever your community is, we need to remember that our spiritual practice between now and whenever the crisis comes is to love and love more, whatever that takes, whatever risks that takes. If our default setting is fear and caution and preservation of the principle, whatever the corpus of treasure we are huddled around, Jesus warns us to change our default setting. Trust yourselves, he says. Trust God, he says. Trust the essential abundance and goodness of the creation, he says. Assume history is moving toward a more splendid moment, even if we cannot see it yet, even if we may not get there for the final show, he says. Take risks. Invest yourself and your treasures, and don't bury what you've got, because keeping it safe is not only a delusion, it's a losing strategy. Love. Love more, love bigger. Take the risk to grow your heart. That's what I hear zooming out by zooming out from this reading to a wider perspective. Peace be with you, and thank you for being here.